All right, horror fans, buckle up, because today we're going deep into the Wrong Turn franchise.
Yes. We're talking about Sawtooth.
We're going to take apart what makes Sawtooth tick, more than just like a scary face and a chainsaw. We've got some excerpts and analysis lined up here, ready to dig in.
Absolutely. Let's get into it.
So, first things first, who is Sawtooth? When you picture him, what comes to mind?
I think when most people picture Sawtooth, it's that hulking figure, right? That disfigured face, the teeth.
Oh, those teeth. Like something out of a nightmare?
Yeah, exactly. Like he immediately taps into that primal fear of the unknown, the other. Something lurking in the darkness that you just don't understand.
It's like he embodies all our deepest, darkest fears about what's hiding out there in the woods.
And that's just his appearance. We haven't even gotten to, his methods, his weapons.
Speaking of, he's not just a mindless monster, right?
Yeah.
There's strategy there, like a twisted intelligence behind those attacks.
Totally. He uses traps. He's a skilled hunter. He's not just some random slasher dude.
Yeah, it's like he's playing a game with his victims.
Uh-huh.
Which just makes it even more terrifying.
100%. There's a cunning to him that just makes him that much more disturbing. He's thinking, planning. He's not just reacting.
And then there's that whole family thing, right? Like, Sawtooth isn't alone out there. He's got one eye, three finger. It's a whole messed up family dynamic.
The family thing is fascinating, and I think it's tied directly to that isolated setting, the backwoods of West Virginia.
Yeah, it's like they're a product of that environment, cut off from the rest of the world.
For sure. And, our sources even suggest generations of inbreeding within the family, which, may have been exacerbated by some environmental contamination.
Right, there's that hint of something toxic in the water, right, in the sequel, I think.
Yeah, something like that. It's definitely not just a case of, like, they're evil for the sake of being evil. There are layers to it.
Layers of messed upness.
Okay.
But yeah, it adds this whole other level of creepiness to their bond. It's not just a gang. It's more like...
This primal, almost.
Yeah, primal. Like a pack of wolves or something.
Exactly. And I think that makes their loyalty to each other even more unsettling.
Yeah.
There's this disturbing kind of dependence and...
Yeah, a warped sense of love almost.
Yeah, something like that. It's definitely not a healthy family dynamic, that's for sure.
Okay, so we've got this gruesome family dynamic, this primal savagery.
Mm-hmm.
But where did it all begin? What made Sawtooth who he is?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. That's where the prequel, Wrong Turn 4, comes in, right?
Yeah.
You get to see Sawtooth before he was, Sawtooth.
Younger years, sanatorium, the whole deal. It's like a glimpse behind the monster.
Exactly. And it shows us that even as a kid, those core traits were already there. The loyalty, the resourcefulness, the survival instincts, all of that.
And the violence, probably. I mean,
Yeah.
He wasn't exactly playing hopscotch in that sanatorium.
No, definitely not. But it makes you think about, nature versus nurture. Was he always destined to become this monster? Or did his environment push him down that path?
Deep stuff.
Yeah.
And it really makes you think about how society often fears and then isolates people who are different.
Right. Like the sanatorium itself becomes a symbol of that. It's a place where society locks away what it doesn't understand.
And what happens when those people, those others, break free? Well, we see the answer in Wrong Turn, don't we?
That's the question, isn't it? And that's what makes horror so fascinating. It forces us to confront those uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world around us.
Absolutely. And it looks like we're just scratching the surface here. But we're going to have to take a quick break. We'll be right back to delve even deeper into Sawtooth's legacy and what he tells us about the nature of horror itself.
Welcome back. Let's get back to Sawtooth. He's pretty different from a lot of the horror villains that were popular back when the first Wrong Turn came out.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It was like 2003, right? Like right after all those Scream movies.
Yeah, exactly. All that like meta horror stuff was huge. All those movies that were like winking at the audience, playing with horror tropes.
And then bam, here comes Wrong Turn with this like raw, visceral kind of fear.
It's like they went back to basics, back to that primal instinct of like survival.
It's like being thrown into a fight for your life against something truly wild. No time for like witty dialogue or clever plot twists.
Exactly. And I think that's part of what makes Sawtooth so scary. He taps into this fear that's just like hardwired into us.
Oh, totally. That deep down fear of being hunted, of being vulnerable.
Like something out of our like evolutionary nightmares.
It's like, when you're alone in the woods, you hear a twig snap and you just know something's watching you.
Yeah. And Sawtooth gives that feeling a face.
A terrifying, grotesque face.
Right. He's not some, like, ghost or demon or some masked killer with a catchy one-liner. He's something tangible, something that feels real.
Which is almost scarier,
Hmm.
because it makes you think, like, could this actually happen?
For sure. That's like the essence of good horror, right? It makes you question the boundaries between fiction and reality.
Okay, but here's the thing that gets me about Sawtooth. He's obviously a monster, right?
Mhm.
But I almost feel, I don't know if pathetic is the right word.
I think I get what you mean. There's that sense that he's like trapped in this cycle of violence.
Yeah, like he's driven by these basic needs, these primal instincts that have been, like, twisted and distorted by his upbringing.
Well, he's definitely a product of his environment. Generations of abuse, isolation.
Yeah. Makes you wonder if he ever had a chance to be anything different.
That's the big question, right? Nature versus nurture. It's a question that's been haunting horror fans for, like, forever.
And it's what makes Sawtooth so fascinating. He's not just a mindless killing machine. There's something else there, something more.
He makes you think about the nature of evil, right? Like, where does it come from? Is it something we're born with? Or is it something that's, like, created by circumstance?
Deep stuff. And I think that's why he's resonated with audiences for so long, even people who haven't seen the movies. He's become this, like, archetype.
Oh, for sure. A symbol of, like, primal fear. That untamed savagery that we try to pretend doesn't exist.
But it's still there,
Yeah.
lurking beneath the surface. Which brings us to the Wrong Turn reboot, right? Totally different direction. New story, new villains.
It's like they were trying to distance themselves from the original movies.
But I feel like even without Sawtooth and his family, they couldn't escape his shadow.
You're right. Those themes are still there, even if they're handled differently.
That isolation, the clash between different worlds, that darkness that's always lurking just below the surface.
It's like no matter how much you try to update the franchise, you can't escape those core elements of what makes Wrong Turn Wrong Turn.
It's almost like the horror genre itself has evolved,
Oh, absolutely. It's less about those like visceral scares now, more about like psychological horror, social commentary.
More reflective of our modern anxieties, maybe.
Right. And that brings us to a really interesting question. Where does this leave a character like Sawtooth? Is he like outdated? Or does he still have something to offer, even today?
That's a really good question, and one that I'm sure our listeners are dying to hear your take on. So where were we? Yes. Sawtooth, horror in the modern world. It's a big question, right? Does a guy like Sawtooth, all primal fear and backwoods brutality, still have a place in today's horror scene?
Well, horror is always evolving, right? I mean, what scared people 50 years ago might not even make you blink today.
Like creepy crawlies in black and white movies.
Exactly. Like special effects have changed the game. Plus, we've got new anxieties, social media, climate change. The world's a different place.
So where does that leave a figure like Sawtooth? Someone who represents this, like fear of the wild, of nature gone wrong. I mean, most of us are more worried about our phones dying than running into a cannibal in the woods.
It might seem like he's outdated, right? A throwback to a simpler, scarier time. But I actually think his staying power comes from something deeper, something that's like timeless.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Sawtooth, when you really get down to it, he represents this darkness that's inside all of us, that capacity for violence, for cruelty. It's not pretty, but it's part of being human.
It's like that saying, there's a little bit of evil in all of us.
Yeah, exactly. And Sawtooth, he just like embodies that darkness in its purest form. He's a reminder that we're not as far removed from our savage past as we might like to think.
So it's not just about the setting, the woods and all that. It's more about the monster within.
Right. And that's why, even though the Wrong Turn reboot tried to go in a new direction, it still ended up dealing with those same themes. The isolation, the tribalism, the dark side of human nature.
Like you can't escape it no matter how hard you try. It's always there, lurking beneath the surface.
And I think that's what makes Sawtooth so compelling even today. He forces us to confront that darkness, to acknowledge it as part of who we are.
It's like he's holding up a mirror, right? And what we see isn't always pretty.
But it's important to look, to understand those darker impulses so we can maybe learn to control them.
Deep stuff. And I think that's a pretty good note to wrap things up on. So, to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Sawtooth. It's been a wild ride.
Thanks for having me.
And remember, the next time you're out in the woods, just listen closely. You never know what might be lurking out there.